So Dan makes his home in Missoula, Montana, visiting this week, the group, and enjoying Saskatchewan. Hopefully we've provided some perspective about this place, and already looking forward to welcoming you back. Thanks a lot for coming, Dan, and looking forward to your talk. Should I turn this off?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the warm introduction, and thanks everyone for coming to this talk and spending time with me. And it's been really just a great time to meet everyone in Mitch's lab, and we've had some great times and tell some stories. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you all today. This is a really bad title, and I apologize for it. The truth is, this title really is, this is a love letter to bird banding and what you can do with it and how much fun, some great questions you can ask with it. So hopefully everyone feels the same way at the end of this talk. Okay, here, got that. Nice try. Good start. Oh. All right. So when I try to describe what I do for a living, I try to say that I'm somewhere in the middle of these three circles here, where I've started out extremely interested in conservation biology. I got my PhD with a population ecologist, and then during grad school, I got really interested in statistical modeling and Bayesian inference. So when I am my day-to-day activities, I try to get somewhere in the middle of these three circles. The early stuff that I did in my PhD work and some of my early postdoc work was really focused on these true clear events. So the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, thinking about how birds respond to something like that. Giant hurricanes coming through the Southeast, how American oyster catchers would respond to that. Just something that's a very clear line in the sand, say this is an event. This could cause some sort of disruption to bird population dynamics or behavior. Let's look at the effects. I've also spent a lot of work with maybe less drastic disturbances, but that are maybe more chronic or more like chronic on the landscape. So looking at the impacts of transmission lines on sage grouse, and also just looking at how, yeah, you can turn it off. Yeah. Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that looks, I think that looks much better. Or looking at how we treat our beaches, how we are ourselves a disturbance event on shorebird behavior, population dynamics. In the last few years, I've thought about kind of scaling out the questions I've been asking, both spatially and temporally, thinking about how birds respond to broad scale shifts in their environment, both from a climatic perspective and from a shift in land use perspective, how this affects species as a whole, how this affects populations within a species differently. And to do this, I've gone back in time so much with looking at what data we can use from way back in the day to start asking some of these questions across large spatial and temporal scales. And there's some real hidden gems out there that have never been published on. So this is, for piping plover enthusiasts, this is the quintessential piping plover paper from 1959. This guy, I think it's Leroy Wilcox, but I'm not positive. He's a duck farmer. He's not an ornithologist. He was not a trained ornithologist. His father was a duck farmer. He was a duck farmer. He loves birds. From 1937 till the year he died in 1978, every summer he went out there and banded piping plovers. He wrote this paper. He doesn't know what an MRAG is. He built one. You could estimate piping plover survival over a 20-year period based on this data alone. It's never been published upon in that context. A real tragedy is, so he died in 1978. This paper ended in 1959. He kept banding birds for 20 more years. He kept banding them. He kept recapturing them. He just never submitted the data. The bird banding lab doesn't have it. It's all sitting in a museum in New York with a curator who doesn't want to share it. I'll get it one day, I promise you. I'll outlive her. But with these kind of data, we can link what happened in the past with what happened now and account for periods where we don't have any data for. So we can actually recreate like 100 years of hyperlocal survival based on stuff that we've been collecting recently, with stuff that Mr. Wilcox collected back in the World War II era up to the 1960s, and start asking questions about how populations have changed. But the reality is I just love banding birds. All sorts of birds, except for birds that are ugly, that are in nests. You have to be, once you hatch, you have to run around, and then I'll band you. So I've spent a lot of time, a lot of summers, a lot of winters, banding all sorts of birds to kind of get the kind of data that I'm interested in asking questions with. And it's going to move this away. Let's find out. All right, that may be better. I want people to walk away from this talk realizing that bird banding is a natural history collection. In the same way that vertebrate museums are storehouses for biogeographical evolutionary biology data, bird banding data is a natural history collection of population dynamics. It is probably the best source of information that we can use to ask questions about how populations of animals change over time demographically for terrestrial vertebrates that we have in existence. And we banded a lot of birds. And probably the greatest joint effort between two countries in ecology is happening now and has happened in the past between Canada and the United States, and that is our North American bird banding program. We're talking about tens of millions of birds that have been banded since the 1930s. Millions of birds have been re-encountered through resites or recoveries. And through this demographic information, we've answered some really amazing questions that we never would be able to answer without banding data. There are some gaps here. There are certain taxa that are well more studied, more banded than other taxa, but across the board, this is our best source of information for asking questions regarding how species have changed demographically over time. And if we're interested in what's going to happen in the future, we really need to know what happened in the past and what's happening right now. If we really want to know how organisms, how populations, how species are going to maintain themselves under drastically changing environmental conditions, both from a climate perspective and from a land use perspective, we really need to start using these data as essentially a groundmark. This is what happened in the past. This is what's happening now. What do we expect to happen in the future? So the goal really of this talk today is to highlight how we can use long-term banding data to explore how populations change over time and how it's really extremely useful for understanding present-day conservation challenges. And I'm going to focus primarily on two systems, royal terns and canvasback and redhead, or two species of diving ducks. And then I'm just going to very briefly talk about what I'm working on with Dr. Wiegman right now with pintails. So royal terns, they are our largest species of crested tern, the second largest species of tern on the planet. It's dwarfed by the Caspian tern, but it's still a very large tern. It is on the slow end of the fast to slow life history strategies. It most likely mates for its partner's life. They lay one egg, they don't re-nest. They hang out with that chick for almost 9 months. They migrate 2 times together. They migrate northward for a north migration before migrating south during the fall. They are a long-lived bird. They're very interesting. We've also, well, not we, one man has pretty much banded or been associated with the banding of about 650,000 royal terns since the 1970s. John Weskey just loves banding birds. He is probably of a dying breed of individuals that were just allowed to band birds without asking questions. He would go out in North Carolina and Virginia, get a whole bunch of volunteers and meet them on the beach in the morning, round up every single bird on the colony, well, it was flightless, put a band on it and walk away. He did that for about 50 years. He's still alive, by the way. He still wants to do it, but he's slowing down a little bit. He's a very interesting man. So now we have this huge resource of information that's never been published on. No one's ever published any survival estimate from these data over a 50-year time frame, 60-year time frame. So this system is going to be mostly in eastern shore of Virginia and North Carolina in that red circle there. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the rural terns a little bit more and then talk about what kind of questions we're going to be asking. So they're a bitey bird. They are on the scale of non-bitey to bitey. They're very bitey. If you ever have had someone use those safety scissors that you had as a little kid, if you had a toddler that was really wail on you with their safety scissors, that's what a royal tern bite feels like. If you give it enough time, it will draw blood, but it takes some time. They definitely give off a Donald Trump staring into an eclipse kind of vibe sometimes. That's the only Trump joke, I promise. And they dense in extremely dense nesting colonies. This is the only colony in Virginia right now. It's in a very weird spot, about 10,000, 11,000 individuals, so about 5,500, 6,000 nests. Each one of these pairs lays one egg. And just to highlight how dense these are, all these little red dots here, those are eggs. You can just extrapolate that there's just eggs everywhere. They space out their nest pretty much if you're sitting on it and another bird sitting on their egg. They can just basically poke their enemy, but nothing else. So they're as dense as they can get without causing any conflict. You can ban these things like you banned geese. They form these things when they are just after hatch. They form these things called creches, and all the chicks gather together. They can't fly, and you go out there the day before, you build a corral, come out there the next morning, start walking toward the creche, towards the corral, and they all kind of walk in there. Now you have 6,000 flightless birds stuck in a corral, and you just slowly go through and ban everyone that you can. As I mentioned before, the chicks refuse to leave their parents, and they beg for months and months and months. So this first picture up here, so in the upper, let's say upper left, that's a couple days after hatch. The one below that, that's about 3 months after hatch. They've already migrated northward. And then the picture on the right, that's about 7 months after hatch. They've already migrated down to Florida. The parents eventually break this connection during the spring migration, and the offspring take a long time to realize that they actually want to breed. Second years don't breed, third years generally don't breed. Fourth years think about it, but they do it poorly. And then by the fifth or sixth year, they're actually realizing they actually have to reproduce. As you imagine, because of this strategy, they live a long time. So the first year, about 75% of the birds wind up dying. So about 70% of the birds wind up dying. But after that, they stick around for a long time. Longevity record, I think, is about 33 years old. By about 20 years, about 1% of that cohort is still alive. But that's pretty good for a bird. So how are they doing? The truth is we don't really know. They're not a species of conservation concern, but at the state level, North Carolina and Virginia both believe that the populations are declining. But this data, the census data, is imperfect. We really don't know. However, if we look at the survival estimates, it's interesting that this decline in abundance coincided with the decline in early survival of first years and second years. So it's indicative that there may be an actual demographic issue here that's causing this population to struggle a bit. So the focus of my research on this was figuring out what caused this. What is the reason that we're seeing the shift in survival for this long-lived bird, and figuring out if there's anything we can do about it. So just to kind of reiterate the life history of this species is we really have three kinds of life history classes here. We have these non-breeders that have lower survival. We have these breeders that generally have high survival. And then we have these subadults who are just doing their own thing. They're not really breeding. Most of them don't go north of Florida. They go down into South America. They're just flying around, and all they do is care about themselves. And eventually they decide that they want to breed. And they generally survive very well. So the question is, why are we seeing differences in survival trends for these three groups of birds? And what are the environmental mechanisms that could be leading to these patterns? When we talk about seabirds, the first thing we think about is, how is it related to commercial fishing? Royal terns, like other seabirds, are extremely sensitive to entanglement. Generally, if fishing line or a hook gets on a seabird, it's going to die. If it gets rescued and goes to a rehab center, they generally euthanize it. There's really no recovery for it. So we can make some hypotheses thinking about how our behavior as a society in terms of commercial fishing and the gear that we're using for commercial fishing could be affecting these birds, and the extent to which that certain age groups would be more sensitive. Are younger individuals more sensitive because they're just learning how to fish? Or are older individuals more sensitive because they have to take care of their offspring? So there could be some clear impacts of shifts in the amount of gear, fishing gear that's in the water that could be driving some of this pattern. So here on the bottom here is just so a time trend of the amount of hooks in the North Atlantic basin associated with commercial fishing, commercial longline fishing, which could be correlated with variation in mortality. However, there's another way that fishing could affect bird demography, and that's through stock depletion. We could see that patterns in the amount of biomass that we're removing each year could have either a direct or a lagged effect on royal tern demographics by depleting their food source. Royal terns primarily feed on small little minnow fish. Atlantic menhaden is a big one. Atlantic heron's another big one. And so we can think that if these commercial industries were affecting those fish populations, we may see an effect on royal terns. So just to do the math for you, the exponential of 20 is in the billions. So we're talking billions of tons of fish, marine life removed by Atlantic trawling. The exponential of 17 is in the tens of millions. So the long line and fishing in the Caribbean is at the lower level, but we're still talking about a lot of biomass removed each year. Some of this is not target fish for royal terns, but some of it is. Atlantic menhaden is a major industry in the Chesapeake Bay. It's used for like fish oils, and it is the primary food for royal terns when they're in Virginia and North Carolina. Independent of fishing, fish are doing their own thing. Fish populations have been highly dynamic over time. Some of these species have gone through major recoveries since going through major population crashes in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But this is another source of information that may be influencing royal terns. So if these fish populations are not impacted by commercial fishing and just affected by some other environmental variation, we may say this may be a driver of royal tern dynamics, population dynamics. So we can think of this simple conceptual model here that we have three types of variables. We have commercial fishing, we got fish, and we got royal terns. And we can kind of outline that there could be these indirect and direct effects of each of these different processes. So just to make things a little bit confusing, the response variable for the terns is mortality, not survival. So a plus sign going to the bird, bad. That means it increased mortality. Minus sign means it's good. So this is a very simple model that we can test and see, okay, how do fish populations, fishing and royal terns, how are they covariate over time? However, that's not the full story. Is these two things, fish and fishing, are also temporally variable and may be responding to climate change. They may be responding both either directly or indirectly as a function of shifts in sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic Basin. So now the model is getting a little bit more complicated. We have a lot of evidence that shifts in sea surface temperatures are affecting multiple different aspects of fish populations. In response, we're seeing that management of the fishing industry is responding to climate change. And then we have so many studies that are demonstrating that shifts in sea surface temperature are affecting seabirds across the world. So now we have this slightly more complicated model where climate change may be affecting our two response variables of interest. Our response variables of interest may be interacting with one another, and all of these may be impacting royal terns. So we built a model to try to see if we can actually tease this apart. by fitting multiple types of information describing variation in trawling, longline fishing, and fishing in the Caribbean, with the amount of hooks in the water in a given year, temporal patterns in Atlantic red drum productivity, Atlantic menhaden productivity, and Atlantic heron productivity, and changes in sea surface temperatures. And basically build an ecological network to test what types of things seem to be supported to influence royal terns. And then we fed that to that, so 650,000 birds that were banded, to see if we could link that with mortality. So these ecological networks are extremely messy. Every single one of these lines is a relationship that we are testing. But luckily, we can use model variable reduction procedures to figure out how information could flow through this network to actually figure out patterns. And we can actually simplify this a little bit more, because the truth is, we're really only interested in royal tern mortality here. So if an arrow doesn't wind up hitting royal tern mortality, which are these gray circles at the top, we don't really need to pay attention to it. So one pathway of how environmental variation hits our response variable interest is this pattern from Atlantic trawling in the North Atlantic, negatively affecting Atlantic menhaden the following year, which then negatively impacts adult royal tern mortality. And this is basic algebra. A negative times a negative equals a positive. So there's a positive indirect effect of trawling on royal tern mortality. So put this in another way, is over the last 60 years, Atlantic trawling has actually declined over time. In that same time period, the Atlantic menhaden population has positively responded to a decreased, basically top-down pressure of trawling. And during the same time, adult mortality has declined, adult survival has increased. So we can plot these things together, and these are basically explaining the exact same source of information, but from two different lenses, one from the lens of fish removal and one from the lens of fish production. We can move on and think about how sea surface temperatures have impacted our most sensitive age group, the pre-breeders, the babies, the 1 to 2 year olds. And we're seeing through time that we are seeing a negative reduction in annual survival of royal terns. And if we link this with sea surface temperatures, we see that they are in fact negatively correlated. We see that as temperatures in the oceans have gotten warmer, we're seeing a substantial decline in royal tern survival. There's about a 50% decline since the 1970s to the present day, which was primarily associated with sea surface temperature. The mechanism, I don't know. We cannot get at that right now, but it is indicative that there may be a problem. And then lastly, we're seeing that our subadults were most impacted by the amount of hooks in the water. They appear to be the age class that's most sensitive to the amount of fishing gear that's in the water, which makes sense. So they're probably the ones that they have the largest geographic ranges, the ones that are flying mostly, and they're spending more time in the Caribbean, they're spending more time in South America, they're spending more time in the Gulf of Mexico. They just have a greater chance of running into fishing gear. So to put this all together, we see that our original hypothesis was generally all correct. It matched what we believed. The variables impacted our age classes differently. So commercial trawling indirectly affected royal terns by reducing Atlantic menhaden production. Sea surface temperatures increased the risk of mortality for our youngest age class. And then the amount of hooks in the water affected the ones in the middle. So this study had some limitations. We were dealing with pretty sparse data. So I said that people had banded 650,000 royal terns. Only 14,000 were ever seen again. 7,000 were recoveries, 7,000 were resites. So it's sparse. And we really can't figure out when and where mortality happened. So we really can't make conservation recommendations for we need to focus on fishing in the North Atlantic or anything like that. So that's a serious limitation of this study. But it does open the door to asking future questions, hopefully. But this made me think about what kind of systems we can ask these questions in that we can actually get at this kind of stuff. And It's really waterfowl are the primary ones that have the data at the scale and the scope to answer these kinds of questions of how and why populations change. What are the specific mechanisms that influence the population change of ducks? And I'm going to just briefly kind of introduce the idea of full life cycle population models because it's critical to what we're doing here in the lab, as well as this study. And the vast majority of research on birds is focused on the breeding grounds. So our little rubber ducky up here, it breeds up in the prairie potholes. The vast majority of waterfowl work, the vast majority of bird work focuses on what's going on in the breeding grounds. How are they reproducing? We band them up there, we follow them up there, we recite them up there. But that's just a part of their life, one part of their life. This little rubber ducky may have multiple different places that it overwinters. And there's costs of going to each of these different overwintering areas. They may be suffering their own issues, these wintering areas. There's a decision to be made about where to go. There's a consequence associated with where they go. And then on the way back, there's another decision to be made. Where do we go when we go back to the breeding grounds? That's a decision. That has a cost. When we ignore this and we just think about annual survival from a bird banded on the breeding grounds to being the following year, it's a mixture of what's going on in the breeding grounds, what's going on the non-breeding grounds, and the costs associated with traveling between the two. The fact that there's so much potential variation, there's so much spatial and temporal variation that could influence this vital rate, it often reduces our power to actually figure out what are the drivers. Because there could be these seasonal dynamics that are correlated with one another. It could be that yeah, I'll leave it at that. So can we do better? I mean, it depends on the species. It'd be really nice if we could at least break this up into two chunks. Surviving the summertime, surviving the wintertime. It'd be even better if we could break this up into multiple chunks and say surviving at this one wintering ground, surviving at this other wintering ground, this other wintering ground, and think about what are the decisions that individuals are making when they go to these places and what are the costs of making that decision. Unfortunately for waterfowl, especially ducks, specifically ducks, is we don't have a lot of repeat re-encounters of ducks. We have not been recording a lot of resites. The information about a re-encounter of a duck is mostly from hunter recoveries. And the downside about that is you can only kill a bird once. And because you only can kill a bird once, we're limited to only getting at an annual survival estimate. There's not enough information to break this apart. If we can't kill a bird twice, we can release them twice, or release a cohort of birds twice. And because these two groups of birds banded before the harvest season and birds banded after the harvest season, have a different exposure period, a different risk associated with being harvested. One is almost immediately ready to be harvested. One has to survive 6 months before being harvested. We can actually estimate sub-annual estimates of survival. We can estimate the survival from a summer to winter, and this estimate from winter to summer. And because of that, we can start thinking about what are the drivers that are impacting these seasonal survival estimates, which may have more of a conservation utility. And then we can link this with other information. We can link this with information describing duck production and duck abundance, and build a holistic model that's really describing duck demographics. And if we do this, if we have multiple different demographic rates that we can model at the same time, we can start thinking about correlations between these two things, or in this case, three things. How is fecundity and summer survival correlated? They may be correlated because they're both positively responding to habitat conditions. We may see that these positive trends in both traits are related to just, in this case, pond abundance. We may see that they're both negatively correlated due to land use change. So the correlations between these demographic rates are interesting in the sense that they are describing ecological variation that is broadly affecting the species through multiple different demographic channels. And it can even be more complicated. We can see these cross-seasonal patterns where fecundity and summer survival affect the number of birds alive in a given summer, given fall. And because of that, we may see a density-dependent response affecting the next season. So we can see these indirect effects of good conditions on one season acting as a negative effect the adjoining season. And then we can expand this out even further and include multiple different species. We can think about kind of the umbrella species hypothesis. We can think about how the two different species or two different populations are both responding to ecological variation the same way or in different ways. There could be some community dynamics, it could be some predator-prey dynamics, it could be all sorts of different questions that we can ask with these kinds of data. But we're not talking about rubber ducks, we're talking about real ducks. Specifically, we're talking about redheads, we're talking about canvasbacks, two of North America's beloved diving ducks. They are similar in a lot of ways. During the breeding season, they both eat similar food. They both nest in similar areas. They both nest in similar times. But there's also some differences. So it's often believed that they're sympatric. They have a lot of similarities in their geographical ranges, at least during the breeding season. But that's not the whole story. Is they primarily winter in two different areas. Canvasbacks are most known for being overwintering in the Chesapeake Bay historically, where they primarily feed on celery grass, which they're named after. Celery grass is extremely salt intolerant. It performs better, it is better off in very low salinity environments. Redheads, on the other hand, primarily overwinter in the Laguna Madre of Texas, where they feed on shoal grass, which is the opposite. Laguna Madre is a hypersaline environment. Shoal grass likes it salty. It wants it saltier than the ocean. So these two species, even though they have a lot of similarities on the breeding grounds, don't have a lot of similarities on the wintering grounds. But that being said, there is a lot of overlap in where these species overwinter. It's just what the area that they're most known for are geographically and ecologically is much different. But when it comes to redheads and canvasbacks, the question on a lot of people's minds is what the hell happened here? These two birds were doing the same for such a long time. And then in about 1980 to 2000, redheads went a completely different trajectory. They exploded following a drought in the prairie potholes. Following that drought, redheads just erupted, canvasbacks did not. And then both populations have since kind of declined since then. So the question is, what did redheads do differently than canvasbacks? Or why did canvasbacks not respond in the same way? So there's multiple, really broadly speaking, potential mechanisms for how this could have happened. It could be that these two species are actually demographically very different from one another. And they just responded to environmental variation that they both experienced differently. It could be that it's something on the wintering grounds, and it's this period where they're not sympatric or they're allopatric, where that was driving the pattern. It was something on the wintering grounds that allowed redheads to have much better population growth. And three, it could be that they're actually interacting with one another. I have not mentioned this on purpose, but redheads and canvasbacks do not get along. Redheads are facultative brood parasites for canvasbacks. They also are brood parasites to themselves, but more importantly, they're brood parasites to canvasbacks. So just kind of, let's see, I'm gonna go a little bit faster. So in terms of the first hypothesis, it could be that redheads were able to capitalize on the shift in pond abundance on the prairie potholes that allowed them to become more abundant more quickly than canvasbacks. As I mentioned before, these two species are actually demographically both similar and different. A lot of the demographic rates, so winter survival of adults, summer survival of the adults and juveniles, are very, very similar. However, redheads are about twice as fecund, but have approximately half the hatch-year survival, winter survival of canvasbacks. So we have the situation where redheads produce more ducklings, but those ducklings are less fit. And we have the situation where canvasbacks produce fewer ducklings, but they have a better chance of surviving the winter. So it could be that the environmental conditions exposed during this period from 1980 to 2000 just benefited redheads more than canvasbacks. Or it could be that there's something going on in the wintering grounds that redheads will be able to, that were more able to respond to That seems unlikely since conditions for canvasbacks actually improved during that period of concern. And lastly, it could be that the whole community kind of started shifting and the wheels kind of fell off for canvasbacks and redheads really started taking advantage of them. So just to kind of re-highlight this, so redheads will lay their eggs in canvasback nests. That reduces the host fitness. It benefits the redhead fitness. So the situation where redheads were able to basically produce their own offspring and then use canvasbacks as surrogate mothers to help produce more offspring, which could have this kind of cyclic effect as redhead populations kept increasing and increasing and increasing, negatively impacting canvasbacks. So it hit some sort of tipping point. Okay. So as mentioned before, we can think about how we can use correlations between demographic rates for these two species to highlight areas that are worth investigating as potential mechanisms. So the fecundity for these two species, the annual variation is highly correlated. Summer survival was pretty much independent, and winter survival was in the middle. So if we kind of look at this in a different way, we see that redhead production is always going to be higher than canvasback production, but it is correlated. It's going the same direction. It's not too deviant from this line, which presents a perfect fit. You see that hatch year survival is always going to be higher for canvasbacks, but it's less correlated with redhead hatch year survival than production is. And then summer survival here in the lower left here is pretty much independent from one another. So each of these things kind of gives credence to one of our different hypotheses. But really, we need to do a deep demographic dive to get at what demographic rates for each of these species was most associated with shifts in population growth. And to do this, the best tool right now to kind of do this is these things called life table response experiments. There's a really nice book by Hal Caswell that gets into this, but if you want it to be understandable, I would highly recommend reading one of Dave Coons' papers that describes this in language that is not matrix math for the most part. But the general idea here is that we measure a whole bunch of demographic rates. We measure population growth. We measure the extent that population growth changes from year to year, and then we're able to basically estimate the change in population growth that was most associated with each of these different demographic rates in each given year. And then we can start making some inferences regarding which are the demographic rates that are most associated with population growth. How does this differ between species? How does this differ across time? So really, we want to take all the demographic rates that we can possibly measure, feed that into a model, see how it's correlated with population growth, and start looking for differences between two species and across time. So right off the bat, I can tell you that duck production is the greatest contributor to population growth, at least for these two species. It explains more variation in redheads and canvasbacks, but proportionately, it explains more variation in canvasbacks than redheads. So about 60% of the variation population growth over a 60-year time frame in redheads was explained by variation in duck production. 85%, it explained 85% in canvasbacks. Winter survival had a substantially larger impact of population growth in redheads relative to canvasbacks. And summer survival and the age structure of the population really had no impact that we could measure. So if we're thinking about what are the mechanisms, the demographic mechanisms that resulted in canvasbacks and redheads diverging in populations, it has to be either related to hatch year survival during the wintertime or duck production. And then we can look how these values changed over time to see if there's any patterns that are worth exploring. All the values here in red indicate years in which duck production was either positively or negatively associated with population growth. And the size of the bars represents the size or the proportion of population growth explained by each of the demographic rates. So when you see a lot of red, it suggests that duck production is driving the wheel. When you see a lot of gray and blues, it suggests that hatch year survival or after hatch year winter survival was driving the car. I guess you don't drive a wheel, do you? You use the wheel to drive. But we can do better. We can make this a little bit more clear. We can break this system, break this time frame into three epochs. We have this first one where both species were doing pretty good, both trending in the same direction. Redheads are doing a little bit better, but they're both going upwards. We have this other one where redheads erupted and canvasbacks kind of did business as usual. And then we have this third one where they both started to decline. And then we can make some inferences regarding how the different demographic rates explain population growth between these three time periods. To think about which were the demographic rates or basically the cause of why redheads did so well. So in this graph, this is just a mock-up, just for the next couple slides, is this black line in the middle is the reference period. Values above the line suggest that that vital rate contributed more to lambda during the comparison period, which in this case is one of the first or the third period. Values below the line suggest that the vital rate contributed less to lambda during a comparison period. And then you can make comparisons between the size of these bars in terms of how important they were to lambda. Okay, so let's compare the first 20 years to the second 20 years. So the period where both populations were doing okay to the period where redheads did so much better. And surprisingly, it's not related to duck production. Duck production explained more variation in population growth during the first 20 years as opposed to the second 20 years. And the proportion explained was pretty similar between the two species. So in other words, it's not the fact that redheads just produce more ducklings that the redhead population growth exploded. In fact, it was related to winter survival. So something happened to redhead populations where they survived the winter at a substantially higher rate in the second 20 years, and they actually started approaching canvasback survival rates, which is really not that, it's kind of unheard of. So this suggests that this divergence in populations was driven by increased winter survival in redheads through some mechanism that we were not quite sure about. And then lastly, we compare the second and the third time period. We see that what happened here is that we didn't see any change in fecundity. Fecundity between these two periods was about the same, but the contribution to fecundity to population growth was the same. But we then saw a decline in winter survival that basically resulted in a population decline in both species. So in brief, during the second and third period, we see that survival rates during the wintertime declined. Survival rates in the summertime increased a little bit, and fecundity didn't change. And together that resulted in population crash in both species. So what do we think caused this eruption? So the figure on the left are the harvest rates for canvasback and redheads across time. And just to highlight this period right there in the middle is from the late 1980s to the middle of the 1990s. There was an extreme drought in the prairie potholes that resulted in some harvest restrictions for the two species, resulting in a substantially fewer number of birds being harvested each year. This impacted canvasbacks a greater amount. Canvasbacks were killed at a much lower rate than redheads. But redhead winter survival was the one that benefited the most. So it's not just the fact that there was some harvest restriction, there's something else going on. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you the answer. So during this period where the population of redheads erupted was immediately really kind of starting at the end of the harvest restrictions through the period after, when habitat conditions on the breeding grounds improved, and then redheads just exploded, but canvasbacks didn't. So we know the mechanism, we know the demographic mechanism, we just don't know why it happened. And we can try to fit this, explain this with different environmental variables, but ultimately just can't quite figure it out. It's not winter survival. Winter survival would have impacted canvasbacks more than redheads, and winter habitat conditions would have impacted canvasbacks more than redheads, and habitat conditions were improving for canvasbacks. It's not related to sea surface temperatures. Sea surface temperatures would have benefited canvasbacks more than redheads in this time period as well. The only thing that was supported that makes sense is that there's some sort of density-dependent association where redheads had higher winter survival rates when populations were booming. But that's not very attractive. So ultimately, we're ending this one with a big I don't know. So we know what the demographic mechanism is, but we don't know why it happened. Okay, yes. So how did this happen? Redheads survived better. How did this happen? Don't know. So sorry to leave it like that, but that's where we're at right now. Okay, so just to bring you back to this slide, I'm just gonna very quickly talk about what I'm doing, what I'm doing with nature. So instead of thinking about how different species the demographic rates are correlated with one another, we can kind of think about how multiple populations of the same species, how their vital rates are correlated with one another. And this is a better name for this would be metapopulation models, where we look at how different groups of birds within different species are interacting with one another, how their populations are changing over time, how they're moving from one population to another, how their vital rates are different. So this is a very simple diagram of a northern pintail. There are breeding populations up in Alaska and the boreal and the curved potholes, and two other main wintering grounds in the Central Valley of California and the Gulf Coast of Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. We can see that on the breeding grounds, we're seeing spatial variation in duck production. So we know that there's something going on the breeding grounds that's resulting in more ducks being produced from certain areas per capita than other areas. So the question is this indicative of certain areas on the breeding grounds performing better than others, or is there some sort of demographic compensation happening elsewhere throughout the life cycle that's basically resulting in this being a little less, I guess, a little less transparent? Is that what I wanted? Sure. Yeah, okay. So as I was kind of mentioning before, is that there's a decision to be made that a bird has to make when it leaves the breeding grounds, and that is, where am I going to go? And with that decision, there's a consequence, there's a risk. What are the conditions there? Will I be able to survive better? Will I be able to put on more resource, more fat storage? Is there a stronger hunting pressure? And those risks have consequences. So we do see that there is some spatial temporal variation in mortality risks associated with where an individual decides to go during a given winter. What we're interested in knowing is, are these populations actually changing their behaviors over time as a function of shifts in habitat conditions on the wintering grounds, and the extent that patterns in population dynamics associated with habitat conditions are correlated with patterns in harvest. So this figure on the right is just a quick mock-up of spatial variation and age variation in the probability of surviving a winter not being shot and the probability of surviving winter from natural causes. So we're really interested in breaking apart the winter period into two survival components, whether or not harvest is a primary driver of mortality or whether or not it's just habitat, and thinking about how this pattern has changed as a function of shift in land use and shift in hunter behavior, hunter numbers. And then ultimately linking this back up with the breeding grounds by allowing the same kind of question from reverse, to think about whether or not individuals on the wintering grounds are making decisions about where they're going to go that following spring based on environmental variation. And ultimately look at how these populations are really changing both from a composition viewpoint and a demographic viewpoint. And that is where I'm going to stop. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.